Hello all and welcome back. When it comes to summarizing and analyzing data in Microsoft Excel, then PivotTable plays a very crucial role. They help you see trends, patterns in your data which help you arrive at important conclusions. They are, in fact, the fastest way to create and analyze data in Microsoft Excel. Combined with pivot charts, they give you a graphical representation of your pivot data, which further assists you in quickly analyzing your data and arrive at important conclusions. So let's begin. Let's say we have the sample data. This is the sales data of 5 employees over a period of 3 years. In this video, we will create a pivot table based on this data, and then we will create a pivot chart. But before we begin, let me share something interesting. When you manually insert a pivot table in a worksheet, you will notice that the pivot is instantly created. But the entire process behind the scene is not that simple. In short, what Excel does is it creates a pivot cache. The pivot cache holds a replica of your data on which the pivot is based. And that is the reason why when you make a change to the data source, it is not instantly reflected in the pivot. You have to right-click on the pivot table and click on refresh, which first refreshes the pivot cache and then the changes are reflected in the pivot table. And hence when we create the pivot table using VBA, we'll have to create the pivot cache first. Before we create a pivot table using VBA, we have to ensure that the data has headers and none of the column has a blank header. Because if you have a blank header, then you will get an error when you try to create a pivot table. In this data, we have headers, so we will not have that problem. Let's launch the Visual Basic Editor. If you're not sure what Visual Basic Editor is, then I recommend watching the video Visual Basic Editor and Introduction. We will press the shortcut key Alt F11 to launch the Visual Basic Editor. Once the Visual Basic Editor is launched, right-click on the VBA project and under Insert, click on Module to insert a module. I will quickly write the base code and then I will explain what we are doing here. Finally, we will build up on this base code. Here, WS is the object variable. This is the worksheet where my data is, which is sheet 1. LRow is a variable which will hold the value from the last row, based on which I will decide what my range is, which will be stored in the range variable, which is RNG. Here I'm initializing the worksheet, and here I'm finding the last row in column A. Finally, I'm initializing my RNG variable, and here I say the range is from A1 to D last row. So if you go back to the worksheet, the range starts from A1 and it goes right at the bottom, which is here 181. So A1 to D181. Obviously, I do not want to hard code this range because in the future you may want to add more data to the table. So you should be able to include that data as well when you're creating a pivot table. And hence I've kept the last row as dynamic. Let's go back. Now this is our base code. We will build up on this. The first thing that we will do now is create a pivot cache. The syntax of creating a pivot cache is expression.create source type source data version. Source type is a required parameter. It can be one of these constants: Excel consolidation, Excel database, or Excel external. The source data is an optional parameter. It is the data for the new pivot table cache. The version is optional again. It is the version of pivot table. Version can be one of the Excel pivot table list constants. The Excel pivot table list constant specifies the version of a pivot table or a pivot cache. Creating pivot table with a specific version ensures that table created in Excel behave in the same manner as they did in the corresponding version of Excel. So these are the constants. So let's go back. Now let's create a pivot cache. We will declare an object variable for pivot cache. Let's call it pcache. So I will declare it here. Dim pcache as pivot cache. And right after end with, we will initialize our pivot cache. Set pcache is equal to this workbook dot pivot cache dot create. Now it is asking us what do we want to base our pivot cache on. What is the source type? It is not an external file, it is not a current pivot table or an Excel scenario, but a database which is in sheet 1. So we will type Excel database, comma. Now it is expecting source data. The source data will be the RNG variable that we have initialized above. So I will type RNG and I'll close the bracket. Now we have two options. First, where do you want to create the pivot table? Do you want to create the pivot table in the same worksheet or in a new worksheet? If you want to create a pivot in the same sheet where the data is, then ensure that the pivot table doesn't overlap with the source data. So keep some gap and then create the pivot. For example, you can place the pivot from column G onwards. The second option is to create a pivot in a new sheet. In this example, we will create a pivot in a new sheet. Here as well, you have two options. Do you want to create a pivot table in a new sheet every time? That means every time you run the code, a new sheet will be created and the pivot will be placed there. The second option is to create a new sheet and we will call it employee sales pivot. And then we will place the pivot in that sheet. And next time when the code runs, it will clear that sheet and then place the new pivot in that worksheet. This way, what will happen is every time you run the code, it will not create a new sheet. So what we'll do is in our code, we will check if there's a worksheet which is called employee sales pivot, and if it doesn't exist, it will create it. And if it exists, then it will clear the worksheet for the new pivot. So let's go back. So let me quickly add a couple of lines here and then I will explain what we are doing. So what I have done here is I have declared an object variable called WSPivot, which will store our new sheet that we will create. This is where the pivot table will be placed. Here I'm checking if there is a worksheet called employee sales pivot, and I have sandwiched it between onError resume next and onError go to 0. Because if that sheet does not exist, then this line will give an error. To suppress that error, I'm using this method. Here I'm checking if WSPivot is nothing. If there is no worksheet called employee sales pivot, then WSPivot will be nothing. And if it is nothing, then I will add a worksheet and I will name it at the same time. I'll call it employee sales pivot. And if the worksheet exists, then I'll clear the cells so that the pivot table can be placed on this worksheet. Now let's run this. To run this code, click on the Run Sub-User Form button or simply click on the shortcut key F5. So I'm going to run this now. And if you notice, a worksheet called Employee Sales Pivot has been added. So let's go back to the worksheet and you will see that this is the worksheet here. Okay, let's go back. Now let's create the pivot. To do that, we will use PivotCache.createPivotTable method. The syntax to create a pivot table is expression.createPivotTable, table destination, table name, read data, default version. Table destination is a required parameter. It is the cell in the upper left corner of the pivot table's report destination range. The table name is an optional parameter. It is the name of the new pivot table report. Read data again is an optional parameter. If you set it to true, it will create a pivot table cache that contains all the records from the external database. Default version is again an optional parameter. This is the default version of the pivot table report. So let's go back. Let's declare an object variable for the pivot table. I'll call it dim ptable as pivot table. And then here I will create my pivot table. Set ptable is equal to pcache dot create pivot table start parenthesis. Now it's asking for the table destination. So the table destination that we want to give is in the new worksheet, which is WSPivot, and in the first cell, which is cells 1, 1. The next thing we will specify is the table name. Let's call it employee sales pivot. and close parenthesis. We are done. Before I run this, let's quickly summarize. Here I'm creating the PivotCache. Here I am creating my new worksheet called WS Pivot. And here I'm creating a pivot table using the PivotCache. Let's run this. If you go back to the worksheet, you will notice a blank pivot table has been created with the name Employee Sales Pivot. And on the right side, you will notice the pivot table fields. Now, before we go ahead and tweak the pivot table fields, let's first decide what we want to see in the pivot. Let's say we want to see the employee name in the rows field, sales and values. What I'm doing right now is I'm manually creating it, and then once we decide, okay, this is the look that we want, then we will try and achieve that using the VBA code. Next, I want to see the year in filters and month in columns. So this is how my populated pivot table will look like. Once the pivot table is created, you can play around with it and see the necessary information that you want to see. For example, here right now, currently it is showing you the values for all the years. You can actually select one of the year and click on OK, and you will see values only for that year. Similarly, you can also change this value and say I want to see only for Jan. You can do that as well. So like I said, you can summarize and analyze the data in Excel using PivotTable very easily. So let's say we want to create this pivot table and we want to keep the pivot fields in these particular sections. So let's go back. Let me quickly add more code to this, and then I will explain what we are doing here. Here I have declared 4 pivot fields. The first one is for the employee, P field employee. Second is for month, third is for year, and the fourth is for sales. The reason why I'm declaring pivot fields is so that when I work with them, I get the IntelliSense. IntelliSense is like when you type the pivot field name and then you type a period, then Excel prompts you to pick an item from the list. That's IntelliSense. So here I have declared 4 pivot fields. Let's go down. Here, what I have done is I have initialized the pivot fields. Like I said, one is for employee name, second is for month, third is for year, fourth is for sales. And here I'm using dot orientation to place the pivot fields. So if you remember, these are the places that I'm placing. So this is the row orientation, this is the column orientation, this is the data orientation, and this is the page orientation. So let's go back. So let's try and run this. What this code will do is it will clear the employee sales pivot worksheet, and then it will insert a new pivot table and align these pivot fields. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go here and I'm going to manually clear it so that we can see how it works. So there is nothing in employee sales pivot, and now I will run it. If you go back, you will notice that the pivot table has been created and all the pivot table fields have been arranged accordingly. Now let's format our pivot field in the data field. Let's change the number format. We will show the data with currency symbol now. And while I'm at it, I will also explain about pivot field function method. If you click on this drop down, you will see an option which is value field settings. If you click on it, you will be presented with a value field settings dialog box. Here you can choose how you want to summarize the data. Currently, it is summing up. You can also change this to count if you wish. So if I choose count and if I click on OK, you will notice that it shows me the count of sales for the employee for the selected options. I'm going to go back and I'm going to change it to sum for the time being. In the code, I will now show you where you can change this if required. You can also change the custom name if you wish. Right now it says sum of sales. You may just want to call it total sales. You can do that as well. Similarly, you can change the number format of your data. So if you click on this and if you click on value field settings, and here is the number format button. Here you can change the number formatting of your data. You can show it as a number or you can show it as a currency or whatever you want to do. So we will make these changes in the code. So I'm going to press cancel. Let's go back and we'll make these changes there. So I'm going to copy this field and I'm going to tweak this. So I'll type with PField sales end with. Inside this, first of all, we want to calculate the sum. So we will use dot function is equal to Excel sum. Here you can choose Excel count if you want, or Excel max or Excel minimum. I'll leave that to you. So we'll use Excel sum. The next thing that we will tweak is the number format. So I want to, let's say, show US dollars with 2 decimal places. So I can do that like this. If you're not aware how the number format works, then you can always record a macro and change the number formatting. That way you will get the number format string. Now let's also give a customized name to this field. So I'll say dot name is equal to total sales. Now let's run this. If you go back, you will notice that our data has been formatted with dollar currency symbol. And if you look here, the name is now total sales. Now when your pivot is ready, you can also apply some pivot table style. So you go to design, and from here you can choose whatever style you want. So for example, I can choose this style, or I can choose this or this. Whatever you like, you can choose that. You can also, if you want, select banded rows. What will happen is when you select banded rows, your data will get those row stripes, alternate row stripes that you can see below. So I'm going to uncheck it. So now what I'll do is I'll go back in the code and I will apply a style in the code, and I will also activate the banded rows. So let's go back. Here I will type dot table style 2 is equal to pivot style dark 5. The next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to show those banded rows. Now you must be thinking, where did I get this from? I know this from memory because I very frequently use this style. If you are not aware of these styles, then do not worry. Simply create a pivot and then record a macro. Apply the style that you want and then immediately stop the macro. In the macro code, you will get the style name. So for example, if I go back here and I click on developer, record macro, okay. And let's say this time I choose, let's say the green color. And then I'll immediately stop the code. Obviously I don't like this color, but just for demonstration purpose, I selected this. Let's go back to the code. In module 2, you will see the table style name. So let's go back, and now I will run this. If you go back, you will notice that my pivot table has the banded rows and the relevant table style. Now let's experiment with our pivot table. Let's say we do not want the year to be shown in the filter, which is in the Excel page field, but I want to show it in the row field below the employee name. So we can do that as well. If I was supposed to do that manually, I will simply drag the year and bring it below the employee name. See, I'm just going to make this slightly bigger. Okay. So now when you have year after the employee name, see how my pivot table looks like. If you wish, you can also show employee name after the year. So if I drag the employee name below the year, this is how it looks like. So now my pivot table has year like this, and below that we have the employee names. So to tweak the pivot fields like we did just now, we can use dot position method of the pivot fields. Let's go back. Here, what I will do now is I will change the orientation of the field year, which is here. So I'll type with p field year dot orientation is equal to Excel page field dot position is equal to 1 and end with. Below the year, we want the employee name. So I have to actually move this before the employee name. And then I will repeat the same thing that I did with p field year. So I'll type dot orientation is row field, dot position is equal to 2, end with. The reason why I have to move the p field year on top of p field employee is because of the position. if I move P field here below P field employee, then you will get an error. Because when we run the code will try to put the employee field at position 2 and it will give an error because there's nothing in position 1. And hence remember, always follow the sequence. So P field here first because that's position 1, and then P field employee, which is position 2. The P field month orientation remains the same. The P field sales orientation also remains the same. Rest everything is fine. And before we run the code, let's also change the orientation of the P field here. Let's manually clear the worksheet so that we can be doubly sure that the code is working. Now we go back here and we run the code. If you go back to the worksheet, you will see that the pivot table has been created with the year and the employee name in the row field, with year on top and employee name below that. So we saw how we can create a pivot table. Now let's go ahead and create a pivot chart. Most of the code for creating a pivot chart is similar to creating normal charts in Excel. If you have not seen the previous video creating and manipulating charts, then I highly recommend watching that video first. Let me quickly write the code and then I will explain what the code does. So what I've done here is I've added two object variables, one for the chart object and one for the chart. Here I'm not only clearing the cells in the WS pivot worksheet, but I'm also deleting all the chart objects if there are any. Here I'm using chartObjects.add method to create a chart object in the pivot worksheet. Here I'm initializing the chart. Finally, I am setting the pivot table range as the source data of the chart. I'm also checking if the chart has any title or not. If there is no title, then I'm creating the title and changing the title text to total sales. I'm also changing the chart type as Excel line. All of this is mentioned in my previous video. So like I said, if you have not seen that video, go ahead and watch that video first, which is creating and manipulating charts. So let's run this. Let's go to the worksheet and you'll notice that the chart has been created. I'm not resizing the chart or tweaking other chart elements in this video. I've already explained how to do that in the last video. One thing which I would however include is how to tweak the pivot fields and the pivot items in the chart. Let's say when the chart is created, I want to see the data for a specific employee. And let's say that employee is Ernie. And I want the data to be shown for the year 2022. So let's go back. I'll make a quick edit in the code and I'll explain it. So what I've done is I've declared an object variable for the pivot item, which is pvt item. And here what I'm doing is I'm looping through the entire pivot items of the pivot field year and I'm checking if it is not 2022, then hide it. Similarly, in the employee name pivot field, I'm checking for Ernie, and if it is not Ernie, then I'm hiding that field. Now let's run this. But before we run this, let me share something with you. When you run this, you will not see the desired results and I will explain why. So let's run this. If you go back to the worksheet, you'll see that the chart has been created. The pivot table has the data for 2022 and for Ernie. Now, when I said you'll not see the desired result, that is because you do not see anything in the chart for Ernie for the year 2000. The chart is empty, and that is because of the placement of pivot fields. Since we are only dealing with one employee, it makes more sense showing months in the x-axis. So let's go back and make a minor tweak to the code. I'm going to change the orientation of the field here. I'm going to make it column field. Similarly for the employee also, I'll make column field and I will change the field month to row field. So I'll copy row field here and I'll paste this here. I'll copy column field and I will paste it here. I will leave the sales orientation as it is. Now let's run this. Now if you go back to the worksheet, you will see that the chart now depicts the sales for the year 2022 for Ernie. And if you look here on the right side, you will notice the year and the employee has been moved to the column section, the month to the rows, and the sales remains where it was. So it depends on how you want to see the data. Simply edit the code and run it again and you will get the chart that you want. Initially, you may have to experiment a little. You may have to tweak the fields, move them around, probably record a macro, see how the code is being generated, and then you edit the code to suit your needs. Time for a quick recap. In this video, we learned how to create a pivot cache, and on the basis of pivot cache, how to create a pivot table. We also learned how to create a pivot chart based on the pivot table. We also learned how to tweak the fields, the pivot fields, whether it was in the pivot table or in the pivot chart. And in this process, we tried 2-3 combinations of the pivot chart. I hope this video was easy to understand, but if you still have any questions, please leave a comment in the comment section below, or you can also email me on support@tamexcel.com. I also have a Facebook page. The link is in the description below. Feel free to join that. And if you have any questions, please post it there. I will be more than happy to help you out. A quick reminder, I'll be posting 2 videos every week, one on Monday and the other on Thursday. And if you would like to extend support towards this channel, then please go ahead, watch a couple of videos, drop a couple of likes if that's your thing. And if you're really interested in learning VBA programming from scratch, then definitely see the playlist. See all the videos there because I have arranged the videos in a certain manner. There's a certain sequence that I have in mind. It will help you. So watch those videos, drop likes there as well. And if you still have not subscribed to this channel, then go ahead and subscribe to this channel by clicking on the bell icon. And I'll see you in the next video when I talk to you about data validation, where we will set a criteria on a cell or couple of cells, and then we'll ensure that whatever the input is done in that cell, it complies with the criteria that we set.